Hello, my name is Judith Albert.
And my name is Jakob Müller. Welcome to Wannsee, looking at the international dimensions of the Holocaust.
In our last episode, we spoke about Greece, and in the episode before, about Turkey. Today, we are talking about another country that was once part of the Ottoman Empire. It's Bulgaria.
Bulgaria only in 1878 gained autonomy in the Ottoman Empire as a result of the Russo-Turkish War. In 1908, it became also formally an independent state.
We already mentioned the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 in our last episode, but they are the key to the understanding of the political situations in the years to follow.
Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria fought for what was left of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. They defeated the Ottomans and afterwards fought with Bulgaria about the distribution of the conquered territories, a battle that Bulgaria ultimately lost.
The Balkan Wars were extremely bloody conflicts with hundreds of thousands of victims. Soldiers, but also civilians, most of them Ottoman Muslims, were murdered by the victorious armies or expelled from their homes.
During the First World War, Bulgaria sided with the Central Powers, that is, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Together with its allies, it was defeated and was one of the vanquished after World War I.
Our guest today is historian and curator Susanna Hassan. She's been working at the Jewish Museum Augsburg for quite a long time. That's also where we both met. In Augsburg, she co-curated a lot of very interesting exhibitions. For example, the last one with Shalom Sisters, Jewish Feminist Positions. Susanna also published her studies about the Holocaust in Bulgaria in Persecution and Murder of the European Jews, so in German, Verfolgung und Ermordung der europäischen Juden, in edition 13. Which was also the edition we talked in our last episode with Maria, so maybe it is worth it to have a look at it. And it's currently translated into English. So we are very happy to have you here in our Josef Wolf library. Welcome, Susanna.
Thank you very much. I'm also glad to be here today and to speak about Bulgaria.
Well, before we start, maybe it's worth mentioning that there was also a podcast on Shalom Sister that was produced by our dear Judith.
No.
So let's go to the first question. Bulgaria was one of the vanquished? Bulgaria was one of the defeated of World War I, as it had been an ally of the German Reich. How did that affect the situation of the Jewish community in Bulgaria?
This affected the Jewish community in many ways, directly and indirectly. The Bulgarian kingdom, as you mentioned, had to deal with considerable social, economic, and political problems, and the loss of territories, which led to ongoing tensions with neighboring Greece, Yugoslavia, and Romania, and the country's isolation in foreign policy. Over the course of 20 years, 3 major upheavals took place, leading to the installation of an authoritarian regime led by the Bulgarian king, Boris III, in the mid-1930s. And all this led to considerable social and political tensions. In times of crisis, the situation of the Jewish population also became worse. Here are a few examples. In the early 20s, there were some sensational kidnappings and blackmailings of prominent Jews by irredentist groups who were seeking to blame the Jews for Bulgaria's misfortunes during the war. In the mid-20s, press censorship was introduced, which meant that Jewish newspapers were no longer allowed to appear in Ladino. And in the mid-30s, left-wing Jewish organizations like Hashomer HaTzair were affected by a general ban on political parties.
Maybe just to short information about Ladino, because it was mostly Sephardic community in Bulgaria?
Yes, the Jews, the Bulgarian Jews were mainly Sephardim, and their native language was Judeo-Espanol or Ladino.
Yeah, in the last episode we spoke about Thessaloniki.
So they were
listeners
descendants from
already
refugees
knows.
from Spain, huh?
Yes, exactly. The majority, there was also a small Ashkenazi minority, but the majority of the Jews were Sephardi Jews.
You write that Zionism was the strongest political movement amongst the Bulgarian Jews in the interwar period. What were the reasons for this, and did that translate into massive migration from Bulgaria to Palestine?
There are various reasons for this, but maybe the most important one is that although there was no state anti-Semitism until the late 30s, Jews in Bulgaria were certainly affected by latent anti-Semitism and ongoing structural discrimination. There were practically no Jews in politics or in Bulgarian parties. Only individuals were able to achieve high posts in the army and in society. So, although there were no written laws that excluded Jews from certain areas of society, their absence was based on social consensus, and thus Jews had to come to terms with it. Even in left-wing parties, Jews remained largely absent. So those Jews who were looking for a field of political activity only had the option of getting involved in inner Jewish matters.
So inner Jewish political subjects get them to Zionism.
Yes, exactly. And in practice, however, this meant less of a determined emigration to Palestine. A couple of reasons for this: the Bulgarian Zionists considered thorough preparation, like a language acquisition and agricultural training, to be necessary, and this required time. And then for a long time, they saw no immediate danger to the majority of the Jews in Bulgaria, in contrast to the Jewish population in other countries.
So decided to stay.
So they mainly stayed in Bulgaria.
Okay.
You already talked about structural anti-Semitism in Bulgarian society. How important were religious prejudices against Jews? How was the attitude of the official Bulgarian Orthodox Church towards the Jews?
In the Orthodox faith, Jews, along with Muslims and Catholics, were considered enemies of the Christians, and this idea was widespread in the 19th century and anchored in Bulgarian literature and folk culture. And in this context, Jews were also seen as agents of the Ottomans and suffered from expulsions and pogroms during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, which led to Bulgaria's independence, just like the Turkish and Muslim population. When an organized anti-Semitic movement emerged in Bulgaria at the end of the 19th century, quite a few clergymen were among its propagandists. The movement remained very fragmented, though, and it was not particularly original. It was highly influenced by corresponding ideas in Russia, Romania, France, and Germany. However, anti-Semitic activists, including clergymen, succeeded in stirring up hatred of Jews, especially in times of social and economic crisis. And a recurring motive was ritual murder rumors. In the context of the persecution of the Jews during the Shoah, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church usually appears in a positive light. And in my opinion, however, a distinction must be made here from the documents of the Holy Synod. This is the highest body of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. We know that not all bishops rejected the anti-Jewish measures from the beginning. In their petitions to the government, they mostly condemned the ban on baptism and initially only stood up for the converts. the tone changed decisively in March 1943, when the deportation plans were in progress and some bishops reported them firsthand.
Before we go to the 1940s, we come back to the 30s. And, let's start with a turning point when 1933, the Nazis came to power to Germany. How was the effect of the Nazis coming to power to the Bulgarian Jews?
From the mid-1930s on, a strengthening of right-wing extremists and anti-Semitic factions could be observed. The official attitude towards these formations was ambivalent. Right-wing organizations had actually been banned in Bulgaria since 1939, but two organizations were particularly important, the Bulgarian National Legions, and above all the so-called Ratnici, supporters of the progress of the Bulgarian nation, was their name. The Ratnici, the second group, on the other hand, entered into a kind of a symbiotic relationship with the Bulgarian leadership, as individual representatives joined the government and the high administration, and the Jewish community took this as a serious alarm signal. During this time, there was also a very strong economic rapprochement with the German Reich, and both had a direct effect on the Jewish population. Jewish representatives increasingly complained about the authorities' growing indifference to violence against Jews and Jewish property. One of the effects was the displacement of Jewish merchants in trade with Germany, which was initiated by the German Chamber of Commerce. And this was a particularly harsh blow when you consider that the majority of the Jewish population were actually merchants, and trade with Germany accounted for up to 70% of the trade volume. To cite a prominent example, Bulgaria's most important transport commodity was raw tobacco, and one of the most important tobacco traders was the Jewish entrepreneur Jaka Seov. The rise of his company, Balkan Tabak, in the interwar period was closely linked to the rise of Remzma Zigarettenfabrik in Hamburg. And in 1937, Remzma terminated the business relationship with Aseov. And in fact, towards the end of the 1930s, Bulgaria itself was also inspired to take measures against the Jewish population. This was prompted by increased refugee movements after the so-called Anschluss. Entry regulations were tightened. Only those with a visa for a third country were allowed to enter Bulgaria. And the Bulgarian police began to illegally deport unwanted foreign or stateless Jews across the border. And this development began on the eve of World War II and long before the first anti-Semitic law was proclaimed.
So can we say that the extremists and the right-wing extremists in Bulgaria were supported from Germany?
Yes, they were supported.
Okay.
Bulgaria declared itself neutral after Germany started the war in 1939. Why didn't it stay that way?
Two reasons were particularly important here. On the one hand, there was the impression of the German success, especially the territorial gains and the prevailing German hegemony on the continent. We remember the Bulgarian territorial goals after the First World War, which thus seemed possible again for the first time. In fact, in September 1940, when it still insisted on its neutrality, Bulgaria was able to obtain South Dobruja from Romania with the support of Germany. The second reason was the spread of the war to large parts of southeastern Europe with the beginning of the Italian campaign in October 1940. Although Bulgaria insisted on its neutrality until the end of 1940, it was clear to the Bulgarian leadership that they could no longer stay out of the conflict. Now it was a matter of knocking out the best conditions. On the one hand, it was about fulfilling the territorial goals. And on the other hand, it was about the military commitment, which Bulgaria wanted to keep as low as possible. And in fact, Bulgaria did not send troops to the Eastern Front and, with the consent of the Reich, maintained diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union until September 1944. The Bulgarian army did not participate directly in the attack on Greece either, but moved into the territories previously conquered by the Germans with a time delay. From the divisions of Greece and Yugoslavia, Bulgaria received Western Thrace on the northern Aegean coast for administration, significant part of Macedonia and the area around Pirot in southeastern Serbia, territories that it henceforth treated as de facto annexed.
Before we go further into the deportations, when the first anti-Semitic law was passed in Bulgaria, it was the same time when Bulgaria was preparing for an alliance with Germany. Was it fulfilling German demands, or was this a Bulgarian initiative?
Legislation, like you said, was initiated and enacted before the formal alliance. There is no evidence to suggest that Bulgaria, as a sovereign state, acted under German pressure. The fact that the first anti-Jewish measures were carried out already in 1939, even before the war began, also speaks against this. At best, legislation can be seen as an expression of benevolence in order to signal on political rapprochement at a time when Bulgaria was still insisting on neutrality.
You already told us that although Bulgaria joined the tripartite pact with Germany, Japan, and Italy on 1st of March 1941, it did not attack, together with the German troops, Greece and Yugoslavia in April 1941, but it was occupying parts of Serbia or Yugoslavia back then and Greece, so Western Thrace. So this is the coast of the Mediterranean, because until then and now also Bulgaria has no direct access to the Mediterranean. And there was a very harsh Bulgarian occupation regime, not only against the Jewish population, but also, for instance, against Greeks. So many Greek refugees had to leave Thrace and go to other Greek cities, like we heard in our last podcast, Thessalonica. Could you tell us something about the occupation regime?
Yes, officially the territories were only administered by Bulgaria. And the final status was to be clarified after the war, but in practice, Bulgaria carried out annexation. And the population in these areas was quite heterogeneous. In Macedonia, the Bulgarians considered only 50% of the population to be Bulgarian. The other half was of mixed ethnic and religious origin. And Bulgaria wanted to create facts, so the status of the territories would be recognized in its favor after the war. And this was accompanied by measures like targeted expulsions, resettlement, pressure, and colonization. For example, all those who identified themselves as Serbs or Greeks were to leave the area and sell their real estate and belongings within a set period of time. Only Bulgarians were used in civil administration, and Muslim educational institutions, for example, were closed. Mm-hmm. In Xanthi, in Thrace, the Bulgarian police authorities examined the possibility of converting a camp for political prisoners into a concentration camp with a crematorium based on the German model. And also resistance by Greeks in the Drama area was violently suppressed by the Bulgarian occupation authorities, resulting in many civilian casualties. As for the Jewish population in these areas, they were deprived from the outset of the possibility of opting for Bulgarian citizenship, which was open to others as a voluntary choice, at least on paper.
Mm-hmm.
So in July 1941, this is 1 month after the German attack against the Soviet Union, the Bulgarian government imposed a 20% tax on Jewish assets, driving businesses owned by Jews bankrupt. At the same time, forced labor for Jewish men was introduced. Who did profit the most by these measures?
Well, the overreaching goal was the social and economic exclusion of the Jewish population, and Bulgarians and the Bulgarian state were to benefit. In Bulgaria, in contrast to other allied states like Romania or Slovakia, there was no German minority that competed with the Bulgarians for the Jewish shares. So the overall goal was the replacement of the Jewish middle class with Bulgarians. Jewish entrepreneurs were forced to give up their businesses, and their competitors, Bulgarian competitors, for example, benefited from this. But the state also enriched itself, and anti-Jewish measures were to be financed in this way. From the summer of 1942 on, in particular, the Bulgarization measures were intensified when a so-called Commissariat for Jewish Affairs was set up, the aim of which was both the economic elimination and the preparation for deportations. Economic plundering went hand in hand with the explosion of labor. According to the first anti-Semitic law, the law for protection of the nation, Jewish men were no longer allowed to perform military or reserve services in the armed forces, but were to be grouped together in labor squads and used for construction work. This measure also applied to members of other minorities, such as Turks. And following protests from the Reich Labor Service, the regime for the Jewish labor groups was tightened up considerably from 1942 on, and they were incorporated into the Ministry of Urban Development. From then on, Jewish men were to be used for particularly heavy work, such as building roads, railroad lines and bridges, draining swamps, or working in pits. And they were no longer to wear service uniforms. They were to be specifically marked, which those affected felt was a severe humiliation. The labor camps for Jewish forced laborers existed until the anti-Jewish laws were abolished in September 1944. Up to 12,000 Jewish men between the ages of 20 and 47 were imprisoned in these camps, where they had to perform hard physical labor from spring until the onset of winter, and were thus unable to provide for their families. The living conditions in the camps were harsh, although the overall mortality rate remained low, and most deaths were caused by accidents at work.
So the situation for the Jews in Bulgaria worsened, but there were also incidents of resistance. In October 1941, the communist Leon Tadger burned a German oil depot. Was it a coincidence that Tadger was Jewish, or were there significant more Jews in the Bulgarian resistance? We already heard that they had a high degree of politicization, that there were a lot of Zionists in Bulgaria.
In fact, this example is atypical, not very common. In general, there was no significant resistance in Bulgaria until the summer of 1943, and large numbers of Jews also joined communist resistance later, but their share was possibly disproportionately high. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there are no studies on resistance in Bulgaria, or no recent studies on this topic. because it is considered ideologically charged today.
Okay.
We come to that later.
So in terms of the attitude of the Jewish population towards resistance, they were divided. Young people in particular joined resistance groups. A few were active very early on, such as the aforementioned Leon Tadja, who was sentenced to death and executed. He was a powerful personality born in Bulgaria in 1903. His father was a lawyer, and Leon Tadja studied agricultural science in Vienna, which he interrupted in order to join his family in Palestine, where he immigrated in 1921. There he joined the Communist Party and advocated cooperation between Jews and Arabs against the British mandate, and was deported to Bulgaria in 1934 for subversive activities.
Oh, interesting.
In his letter, which we edited, he describes the reasons for his act of sabotage and mentions the imprisonment and shooting of Jews and communists in Serbia. And this document is unique on the one hand because in the Bulgarian context we have hardly any contemporary written testimonies, so-called first-person documents written by Jews, especially those who joined the resistance. And on the other hand, it is a very early mention of murderous actions, specifically against Jews.
Yes, and that's also a source that in Bulgaria, some people at least knew about the German massacres of Jews in other occupied countries and neighboring Serbia.
Yes, I refer in the introduction of our documents to a document from the end of 1941, which is a diary entry by Vasil Mitakov, Minister of Justice. And in it, he reports on a lecture by a member of the parliament, the journalist Todor Kožuharov, who had traveled to the Soviet Union at the invitation of the Germans and had witnessed mass shootings of Jews there. Based on this observation, Kožuharov predicted in his lecture that the Jews in the Soviet Union would be annihilated in the course of the war. Unfortunately, we do not know firsthand what exactly Kožuharov had observed, nor do we know how the audience took the news of what conclusions they drew from it. But it is interesting because he could not be accused of atrocity propaganda because he was pro-German. And later on, he was one of the harshest critics of the deportations from the government camp. But there are also other references from the same early period, even if we cannot say at that time that these messages or news were widely disseminated or unmistakably understood. In November 1941, for example, the Bulgarian police escorted about 200 Jews who had fled from the shootings in German-occupied Serbia to Skopje, back to Belgrade, where some of them were murdered shortly afterwards.
So, can we say that Bulgaria knew about the massacres, especially in the Soviet Union?
I think we can say that the Bulgarian leadership at least had some knowledge, although they maybe didn't know the exact scope or the exact technique. How Jews were exterminated, not only in the Soviet Union, but also in other parts of
and the Bulgarian population or the people in Sofia?
Well, the level of knowledge was much greater by the end of 1942. And this is also shown by Jewish testimonies, among other things.
What was the change in, what would you say, 1942?
Mm-hmm. In autumn 1942, the Jewish population was expecting to be deported, and they knew for certain, or we know this from letters, they expected that a deportation meant a certain death.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So as we are in the house of the Wannsee-Konferenz, Bulgaria is mentioned in the Wannsee Protocol with 48,000 Jews living in Bulgaria. And it seems that in 1942, the Germans expected the Bulgarian government to be cooperative in the Holocaust. So when Martin Luther, who was one of the participants in the Wannsee-Konferenz, who participated for the Foreign Office, asked for the permission to deport Jews of Bulgarian nationality, so who lived in Germany and other parts of German-occupied Europe, the Bulgarian Foreign Office gave its consent immediately. And this is very much in contrast with most other neutral and allied countries. We heard about Turkey, for instance, who were much more reluctant to hand over their Jewish citizens to Germans. The Bulgarian government gave also its consent for the deportation of Jews from occupied Thracia and Macedonia. We already heard about that they were deporting Serbian refugees back to the German-occupied zone. But when it came to the Bulgarian mainland, they refused. What is the reason for the change of this very, I would say, compliant attitude towards the deportation of Bulgarian Jews abroad, or Thracian and Macedonian Jews, and the refusal to deport Jews from pre-war Bulgaria?
This is a question of very complex dynamics. From the beginning, the Bulgarian leadership affirmed its willingness to deport all Jews from the occupied territories. On the question of the inclusion of Jews from the Bulgarian mainland, however, it was increasingly hesitant. The reasons for this were probably the insight that the current war situation was critical for the Axis powers. Negotiations took place and in the end of 1942, in the beginning of 1943. Also, there were increasing foreign interventions in favor of the Jews, for example, by the British and Swiss governments. But also, there was a concern about possible resistance in Bulgaria itself. However, despite any doubts, on February the 12th, 1943, the Bulgarian government, agreed to a plan for the deportation of 20,000 Jews from the new territories, which were the occupied territories, including the undesirable Jews from the heartland, from the mainland. And we know that in the occupied territories, there were only about 13,000 Jews. So the rest of the quota had to be filled in with Jews from the mainland. The Jews who were still Bulgarian citizens, about 8,000 persons, would lose their citizenship when they leave the country. Despite strict secrecy, Bulgarian Jews learned of the plans and were able to start some impressive public protest. From Kustendil, a small town in western Bulgaria, from which all Jews were to be deported, they managed to organize a delegation who won the deputy speaker of the parliament, Dimitar Peshev, as an ally. He was outraged that deportation plans were made without the approval of the parliament, and together with other members of the parliament confronted the interior minister. Cornered and in consultation with the prime minister and presumably the king, the deportations were stopped. In the meantime, not only internal resistance had stirred, but also protest from abroad, and the Bulgarians have learned that of the Allied states, only Croatia was still sticking to deportation plans. Nevertheless, the Bulgarian leadership apparently never managed to put an end to the deportations from the occupied territories. On the contrary, the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs and the Bulgarian authorities there carried out this part of the agreement with the German Reich with great efficiency. The motives for the cooperation were obvious. On one hand, the Bulgarian leadership underlined thereby their claims to the occupied territories vis-à-vis the German Reich. And on the other hand, the deportations there came to the Bulgarian homogenization and colonization efforts. In the heartland, on the other hand, where these motives were lacking, the Bulgarian leadership was increasingly inclined to give in to internal resistance to deportation. The decisive factor for this was probably not so much humanitarian reasons as the growing concern about the consequences in the event of a German defeat in the war, which seemed increasingly likely. Now Bulgaria signaled its restraint to its German ally. A second deportation attempt in early summer was also not implemented, and Bulgaria henceforth pursued a stalling tactic against German pressure, justifying this with the fear of retaliatory attacks.
So can we say that this fact that they resisted or that they stopped one deportation is the reason why Bulgaria later on saw themselves as the resistant country during World War II? Are there more examples for resistance? Because this is, it is extraordinary that the government is trying to stop the deportations.
This is a good question. Actually, this rescue narrative, or some would say even rescue myth, is still the dominant narrative in Bulgaria today. And recently, the French historian and political scientist Nadège Ragarou published a wonderful monograph that explores in great detail the question of how and why this narrative has been so successful. One of the conclusions she draws is that the rescue thesis, which paradoxically emerged in 1945 as part of the world's first post-war trial against the crimes against the Jews that took place in Bulgaria. So this thesis successfully burned all other aspects of the topic out of the public consciousness and prevents them from being examined in detail to this day. In Bulgaria, for example, the question of responsibility for the deportations from the occupied territories is usually answered negatively, with reference to the alleged lack of sovereignty over the territories or the supposed lack of knowledge that deportation was tantamount to death. According to these theories, Bulgaria could not have resisted its ally and would otherwise have had to reckon with dire consequences. The fact is, however, that Bulgaria did not even consider it. Mm-hmm. And we also know of other allies, such as Italy and Hungary, who successfully resisted the calls for deportation when this was possible, before German occupation, and in Italy's case, even from occupied territory. I would say it's high time that Bulgaria addresses these aspects, in addition to the deportations and the rescue from the mainland, also the plunders and the exploitation of labor. And we have wonderful research actually in Bulgaria, but also tens of thousands of sources that have been edited, but are simply ignored by the public and even by many historians.
So the official point of view is, sorry, we couldn't do anything about it. We were powerless and we did what we could do. But there were Bulgarians who did cooperate and who raided Jews in the occupied territories, and the deportation, I don't know, they went until Austria, I think, under Bulgarian authority?
It depends. Those from Thrace, I think, were escorted partially by Bulgarians until Treblinka, or until a place where they were handed over to the Germans, and those in Macedonia were handed over in Skopje to the Germans because they traveled by train. But of course, they were rounded up by Bulgarian police. They were brought to the transition camps and even further.
Are there other examples for resistance?
The first anti-Semitic law, called the Law for the Protection of the Nation, provoked such debates, for example, in parliament. And at the same time, Jewish representatives turned to civil society groups with numerous petitions and were able to gather impressive protests, including from the official representatives of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, but also fellow workers and neighbors. The protests in 1940 were fueled by events such as the tragedy of a shipwreck involving Jewish refugees from Bulgaria in the Sea of Marmara in December 1940, in which around 200 people died. Left-wing groups also took part in the protests and combined them with resistance to another legislative initiatives aimed at bringing youth associations into line. However, these broad protests in 1940 were unsuccessful. The parliament voted in favor of the law, and the king approved its entry into force in January 1941.
So can we say there were several resistance?
We can say that resistance was particularly important and also strong in the initial phase around the introduction of the first anti-Semitic law, and after that in spring of 1943 when deportation plans become known.
Okay.
So in September 1944, the Red Army liberated Sofia, and there was a tribunal. So I think one of the first trials, or even the first trial against perpetrators. Could you tell us more about this tribunal, this trial?
Yes, the world's first post-war trial against the crimes against the Jews took place in Bulgaria in the beginning of 1945, but it largely missed its target, ending with few and in some cases very mild sentences. The deportations from the occupied territories, for example, were also not the focus of the trial. Moreover, the trial already anticipated the thesis that the majority of the Bulgarians were opposed to the anti-Semitic politics of the Bulgarian leadership.
So we can say that this trial was already giving the idea or giving the arguments for the later on remembrance on the Holocaust or the deportations in Bulgaria.
Yes, I think we can say that this rescue narrative emerged or started its dissemination during the trials.
Okay, thank you very much for this very fascinating insight into Bulgaria in the interwar years and Bulgaria during the Holocaust.
Well, thank you, Susanna. It was nice to see you again. And yeah, thanks for that episode.
Thank you for having me here.